Folks, General Motors of Canada put out a press release. It celebrated a milestone: 500,000 Chevrolet Silverado trucks built at the Oshawa assembly plant since November 2021. It used words like world-class and exceptional skill and pride, and what comes next. It was the kind of press release that sounds like a company deeply committed to the place it is writing about. What the press release did not mention is that the plant is running on 2 shifts, that 500 direct GM workers were laid off on February 2nd of this year, that another 700 supply chain jobs went with them, that the factory in Ingersoll that was Canada's first large-scale electric vehicle plant is essentially idle, that the workers in St. Catharines who were promised EV motor jobs are still waiting, that an American industry analyst published a report this week warning that Oshawa may lose its light-duty truck production entirely before the year is out, a move that would take the plant from 2 shifts to 1, and that when the jobs left Oshawa, they didn't vanish, they went to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the man who represents the workers who got them said, quietly and honestly, that he wasn't going to say no. That is the real story, not the press release. The press release is what a company says when it wants you to feel comfortable about something that should make you uncomfortable. The real story is what is happening to the city that has been building cars since 1907, and what it means when a company that has received more than $1.5 billion Canadian dollars in investment and government support since 2020 decides that the volume is better off in Indiana. Let's go back to the beginning, because the history of the GM Oshawa plant is the history of modern Ontario in miniature. At its peak in the 1980s, 23,000 people worked on that site. 23,000. It was not just a factory, it was the economic foundation of an entire city and a surrounding region. Oshawa's identity, its tax base, its school system, its housing market, its restaurants and suppliers, and every business that served the people who worked those shifts, all of it was built on the assumption that cars would keep being made there. Then in 2018, General Motors announced it was closing the Oshawa assembly plant. The stated reason was market forces, declining demand for the sedans the plant made, a shift toward trucks and SUVs, and eventually electric vehicles. The closure eliminated 2,500 direct jobs. Workers who had spent decades building Chevrolet Impalas and Cadillacs watched the last vehicles roll off the line in December 2019. For 2 years, a site that had produced vehicles continuously since 1907 sat largely quiet. Then came what looked genuinely like a second chance. In November 2020, General Motors announced it was investing $1.2 billion to retool the Oshawa plant and bring it back as a truck facility. Chevrolet Silverados, the most popular trucks in Canada. The plant would be modernized, jobs would return, and Oshawa would be back. It was one of the fastest plant relaunches in GM's history. The first Silverado heavy-duty rolled off the line in November 2021, just 12 months after the announcement. By 2022, the plant was running 3 shifts, 6 days a week, with 3,200 hourly workers. 50% of the new workforce were women. Politicians stood on the plant floor and declared it proof that Canada's auto sector had a future. In June 2023, GM invested another $280 million for next-generation truck production. Then $63 million more in early 2026, bringing total GM investment in Oshawa since 2020 to $1.5 billion. The federal and provincial governments contributed $518 million on top of that. Unifor President Lana Payne called continuing to invest in Oshawa auto workers the skills, hard work, and dedication that fuel Canada's economic engine. GM Canada's president said the plant would continue to build pickups with Oshawa pride for years to come. That was June 2023. 18 months later, everything changed. On May 2nd, 2025, General Motors announced it was cutting the 3rd shift at Oshawa. The reason given was what the company called an evolving trade environment. That phrase means something specific. It means Donald Trump's 25% tariff on imported vehicles, which made it significantly more expensive to build a truck in Canada and sell it in the United States. GM, which makes its most profitable vehicles, the Silverado and its variants, for the North American market, did the math. And the math pointed south. The shift cut would eliminate approximately 500 direct GM employees at the Oshawa plant. Another 700 jobs would go in the supply chain, companies that make parts, run logistics, and service the Oshawa operation. In total, more than 1,200 jobs in the Durham region were gone. Unifor Local 222's bargaining chairperson said what every one of those workers felt. It's reminding the company that these are our jobs, not American jobs. GM thanked employees for their contributions and said it would provide supplemental unemployment benefits equal to 70% of regular weekly earnings combined with employment insurance. 70% of your wages, paid out while a factory in Indiana does the work you used to do. Because that is precisely what happened. While GM was announcing the Oshawa shift cut in May 2025, its plant in Fort Wayne, Indiana, quietly hired 250 temporary workers. Fort Wayne builds the same trucks, the Chevy Silverado light duty, the GMC Sierra. When CBC News went to Fort Wayne to ask what was happening, the bargaining chairman for UAW Local 2209, the union representing those Indiana workers, was honest about it in a way that deserves to be heard directly. He said he respected Canadian workers, that nobody in Fort Wayne raised their hand and asked for those jobs. But then he said this, when the company comes to me to increase volume, I'm not going to tell them no either, because it's job security for my people, and hell, if I can corner the market, I will. That is not a villain speaking. That is a man doing exactly what you would do if you were him. The villain, if you're looking for one, is not in Fort Wayne. The villain is a trade policy that made building a truck in Canada economically irrational, and a corporate decision that acted on that irrationality with no particular obligation to the community that had just welcomed it back with $500 million of taxpayer money. The announcement in May 2025 said the cut would happen in the fall. Then it was pushed to November, then to January 30th, 2026. Each delay kept 750 workers employed a few more months and extended jobs at 1,500 supplier positions for a few more weeks. Then on February 2nd, it happened. 500 workers placed on layoff. The third shift, dark. But Oshawa is only one piece of what GM has been doing to Ontario's auto sector. To understand the full picture, you need to go 40 minutes southwest to Ingersoll. The Carney assembly plant in Ingersoll opened in 1989 as a joint venture between GM and Suzuki. It built a variety of vehicles over the decades before GM became the sole owner in 2009. Then, in 2021, GM pledged $1 billion to retool the Ingersoll plant into something Canada had never had before, a large-scale, all-electric vehicle manufacturing facility. The Bright Drop electric delivery van would be built there, making Canada a player in the commercial EV market. It was the kind of announcement that politicians love. A specific dollar figure, a specific community, a specific technology, a specific future. The federal and provincial governments provided $259 million each. In 1987, those same governments had given $112 million to help build the Ingersoll plant in the first place. In April 2025, GM shut the Carney plant down. The stated reason was weak demand for the Bright Drop van and high inventory levels. About 500 of the 1,200 unionized workers were told they would be indefinitely laid off. GM said it would reopen in October at half capacity. Then in October 2025, GM announced it was ending Bright Drop production entirely. Workers were offered 26 weeks of pay and told to make their decisions by January 7th. The plant that was supposed to be Canada's electric vehicle future is now, in GM's own words, being assessed for future opportunities. That is corporate language for, we don't know what to do with it. And then there is St. Catharines. The GM propulsion plant there, which builds engines and transmissions, had its workforce cut in half. down to 600 workers. The transition to EV motor production that was supposed to happen in 2026 was pushed back 16 months to 2027. 1,000 workers who had been counting on those EV jobs are in limbo in Niagara region. And Ford's Oakville plant, which shut for retooling in 2024 with promises of a new electric future, eventually scrapped the EV plan entirely and switched to gas-powered Super Duty pickups, reopening in mid-2026 with roughly 1,800 workers, a shadow of its former scale. Counted up across Ontario, Oshawa lost its third shift, 1,200 jobs including supply chain. Carney in Ingersoll effectively shut down, over 1,000 jobs. St. Catherine's propulsion plant cut in half. 600 workers remain, where there were once 1,200. Brampton Assembly, as covered in this channel last week, dark since December 2023, with 3,000 workers in limbo. Ford Oakville reopening at reduced capacity after years of closure. The Ontario auto sector, which employed over 100,000 people at its peak and generated more economic activity per dollar of output than almost any other industry in the country, has been systematically dismantled over 18 months through a combination of American trade policy and corporate decisions that prioritized the American market over the Canadian workers who had just been given billions in public support to stay. Here is the number that cuts through every press release and political statement. In 2025, General Motors reported more than $12 billion in pre-tax earnings. $12 billion. The same year it cut the third shift in Oshawa, ended bright drop production in Ingersoll, and halved its St. Catherine's workforce, GM turned in one of its best financial years on record. It then announced a $6 billion stock buyback and a dividend increase. The company was not failing, it was not struggling, it was thriving, and it chose, rationally and deliberately, to let Indiana and Ohio and Michigan share in that success rather than Durham region and Niagara and Ingersoll. Now hear the warning that nobody in Ottawa wants to talk about. Sam Fiorani is the Vice President of Global Vehicle Forecasting at Auto Forecast Solutions, an American industry intelligence firm. This week, he published an assessment that the Oshawa plant may lose its light-duty Silverado production when next-generation truck production begins later in 2026. A move that would take the plant from 2 shifts to 1. GM denied the report. But Fiorani also said something about Oshawa that deserves to sit with you. He said the plant has for a long time been a pawn in the automaker's North American production plans. That GM offers Oshawa just enough product to maintain stability and manage union negotiations, without ever making long-term commitments. That every time the plant was up for closure, GM offered Unifor a product for a limited time, not a future, a reprieve, and that the volume cut in Oshawa can be easily recovered from other factories, because GM has so many Silverado plants that Canada is, in production terms, redundant. That is the reality underneath the milestone press releases and the celebrations of 500,000 trucks. Oshawa builds good trucks. The workers are skilled and the quality record is exceptional. 29 J.D. Power awards since 1999, more than any other GM plant in the world. The plant is not failing. The workers are not failing. What is failing is the policy environment that was supposed to make it rational for GM to keep building here. And the funding model that assumed a check from Ottawa was a substitute for a structural reason to stay. Canada has given General Motors billions of dollars across 4 decades, $10.8 billion in the 2009 bailout alone, with a $2.8 billion loss to taxpayers. Then $1.8 billion in the Oshawa and Ingersoll retoolings of the 2020s. Then another $518 million in government co-investment. And every time the checks arrived, there were politicians at podiums talking about long-term commitments and the future of the auto sector and the jobs that were going to be secured for years to come. And every time, some years later, the jobs went somewhere else or shrank, or the product was cancelled, or the tariffs changed, or the market shifted. And the same politicians were back at different podiums, expressing disappointment and demanding companies honor their commitments. The workers in Oshawa know this pattern. They lived through the 2019 closure. They celebrated the 2021 reopening. They are watching, right now, as an analyst in Pennsylvania publishes a report saying the light-duty production might leave before the year is out, and the company issues a denial that does not include a specific commitment to keep that production in Canada. That gap between the denial and the specific commitment is where the real answer lives. And the workers who have spent their careers building the trucks that made GM $12 billion last year deserve better than to live inside that gap indefinitely. Yesterday's press release celebrated 500,000 trucks. It talked about exceptional skill and pride and what comes next. It did not mention Fort Wayne. It did not mention the 1,200 jobs that left in February. It did not mention the Carney plant or St. Catharines or the industry analyst's warning published this week. It mentioned $343 million in ongoing investment and said Oshawa continues to play a key role. Which is true, until it doesn't. And when that day comes, there will be another press release expressing gratitude for the contributions of affected employees, and another round of politicians expressing disappointment, and another round of government officials assuring the public that contracts will be enforced and money recovered. And the workers who built those 500,000 trucks will be left wondering how a company that earned $12 billion in a single year decided that their shift was the one that had to go. That is the story of General Motors and Oshawa, not the milestone, the gap between the milestone and the truth.